The Tudor History and Travel Show is a podcast that brings Tudor history to life by exploring Tudor places and artefacts in the flesh. You will be travelling through time with Sarah Morris, the Tudor travel guide, uncovering the stories behind some of the most amazing Tudor locations and objects in the UK. Because when you visit a Tudor building, it is only time and not space which separates you from the past. And now over to your host, Sarah Morris.
Hello, my time-travelling friends. It's Sarah here, the Tudor Travel Guide, and I'm recording this podcast on the 31st of May, I think officially the last day of spring. And finally, summer has arrived here. Boy, have we been having some horrendous weather, but the sun is out and it feels like summer is finally here. And so we are well poised to dive into our next on-location episode, because today we are going to be featuring one of my favourite places in London to visit. And that, of course, is the Charterhouse. Now, one of the reasons I love the Charterhouse is it is so off the Tudor trail, as you will hear at the end of my recording with our guide today, James, who talks about just how peaceful and how quiet this little area of London is. And indeed it is. It's an oasis of calm. And perhaps that is very fitting, given the fact that the Charterhouse, of course, started its life as a religious institution of some prestige and renown. Well, we'll come to that in a moment. But first of all, I just wanted to give a shout out to my Live Like a Tudor weekend, which is coming up at the end of August. Now, COVID has been a difficult time for many of us, but finally here in the UK, we are getting out and about, as I have been saying in previous podcasts. And thankfully, fingers crossed, with the vaccination programme still going well, it looks like we are still on track to enjoy a wonderful, immersive weekend at the Old Hall, just outside Norwich in Norfolk. And we will be, of course, staying with Brigitte Webster from TudorExperience.com. And believe me, we have a whole host of Tudor entertainment lined up. We have talks, we have Tudor food, we're going to be doing archery, there'll be Tudor dancing, and of course, we get to visit one of the largest reenactment fairs in the world. Certainly, probably, I would say the most authentic, and that is Kentwell. We'll be having a lovely day out there. So if you want to indulge and join what will be a select, intimate little band of Tudor lovers, then make sure you check out the link in the description associated with this podcast. And when you follow the link, you'll be able to find out more information about the dates and the itinerary. And if you wish, you can also book your place. It would be lovely to meet you in person. Okay, I'll give a little reminder of that at the end of this podcast, but right now I think it's time we go time travelling, and you can join me as I meet up with our guide for today in the Great Hall of the Charterhouse. Now, you will hear me mention in the podcast, but I will give a heads up to say that this is a working building. It is home to a number of elderly residents who are cared for by the Charterhouse. You will hear more about the role of the Charterhouse in the podcast. And so you will hear the everyday sounds of life going on around us, including the kitchen, which is getting ready to serve dinner in the Great Hall. Okay, so let's go over right away and meet up with James. So hello, James. Thank you so much for inviting us here to the Charterhouse today for this month's podcast.
Well, welcome. This is a fantastic place. Not that many people have actually visited before. We've been open for about 4 years. now.
Oh, is that all? Because I was just saying that we must have come here about 4 or 5 years ago. I couldn't quite remember, so we must have been amongst the first people to come through the door.
2017 was the grand opening of the Charterhouse. It was a project called Revealing the Charterhouse, and it was all about inviting people in to share this wonderful heritage.
So the Charterhouse is an amazing historic property in London. I think it's overlooked, and I want to promote that today and encourage everybody listening to make sure if they come to London to put the Charterhouse on the map. It's got an amazing history, hasn't it? And that's what we're going to be exploring today.
It certainly has, yeah. We talk about living the nation's history for more than 600 years. So you've got people characters from history that people will be familiar with. You've got nationally important events that have happened here. And you've got those spaces that still survive today. This goes all the way back to the Black Death in 1348. It takes us right through the drama of the English Reformation, the Tudors, and all the way through to today. It
is absolutely steeped in some amazing Tudor history, and of course, as the Tudor travel guide, that's why I really wanted to come here today, although we'll be touching on the whole story of the Charterhouse. But before we dive into it, maybe you just want to introduce yourselves and let people know who you are and what you do here.
Yeah, of course. I'm James, and I'm part of the museum team here at the Charterhouse. We're a new department at this very old charity that was put together in 2017 to open the place up to the public, to put on a programme of guided tours, to show people around and to share the fabulous historic collection in our museum.
Well, I feel very, very honoured today that you're here to take us around. But I would just say to the listeners that this is very much a lived-in house, isn't it? And we're going to be walking around and hearing some sounds around us. Like in the moment, you can hear the kitchens because we're in the Great Hall, and it's soon going to be lunchtime. So people will hear the sounds of everyday life going on around
That's
them.
right, yeah. As we go around, you might hear the bell ringing for lunch just before 1 o'clock.
Ooh, that's going to make my tummy rumble. Well, OK, that's brilliant. So let's get going with the story. So, James, you brought me to this really interesting looking doorway, and I'm wondering what's behind that closed door.
Well, we're in the adjoining room to the Great Hall, so we're still very much in the Tudor house. We're in the 1540s, if you will. But what we're about to do is go down through the doorway into what remains of the Great Cloister of the Carthusian Monastery. This takes us back in time to 1371, which is the oldest built fabric of the Charterhouse.
Oh, fantastic. Let's go and explore. Oh, it's so cool in here, isn't it?
The cloister's cold all year round. The only time I've ever known it to warm up was in the 30-degree heat wave that lasted for about a month a couple of years ago. So it's a nice place on a warm day like today. Chilly in the winter.
So we've got this. How long is this part? How big were the cloisters originally?
What we have here is the remains of a walkway that would have had about 3 monastic cells, possibly 4. It's truncated because, as we've said, the building's been used for lots of things down the years, and I can explain why that happened. But it wouldn't have looked much like what we see today to the monks. What they would recognise is the wall on the left-hand side of the walkway, which is rough grey stone and the remains of
a rather fabulous looking medieval doorway here that we've got. So it's in a very pointed arch this time, but there's nothing behind there anymore, is it?
Nothing at all. There's a brick wall there. On the other side of this wall is one of the gardens. I said before, the brothers here enjoy about 7 acres of gardens, this forms one of the perimeter walls. Actually, the Charterhouse site would have been on the other side for the monks. This would have gone round in a great square, turning right at the far end, right again, and joining up to the church buildings on the south side.
Right.
None of which remains today.
What a shame.
And the reason for that, as we've heard, is that Edward North acquired the old monastery in the 1540s and turned it into his house. And the cloister was used as part of that.
So maybe this is a good time for you to tell us about the Carthusian order and also the fact just how important this monastery was.
It was. It's one of several large monasteries dotted around the edge of the City of London. It's particularly unusual because of who the Carthusians were. The building of monasteries had become slightly less popular by the 14th century when this one was built, but the Carthusians particularly enjoyed royal patronage. When charterhouses, as they were known, were established, it was usually on royal order, or for a very, very important reason. So we know that one of the Carthusian houses in Somerset was established by Henry II as part of his penance for the murder of Thomas Becket.
Right.
This one here was established to pray for those who died in the Black Death of a generation earlier in 1348.
I see, because there is the square outside is an old burial ground, right?
That's right. So it was opened up as an emergency plot for burying those Londoners who couldn't be accommodated in the city churches, churchyards. So many Londoners died in that winter, 1348 and 49. They had to open up emergency burial grounds.
How do we know how many bodies are in there?
We don't. It's never been fully excavated, and it never will be, I'm sure. But we know roughly where it was, because today's Charterhouse Square preserves at least a part of it. It's likely that some of it goes under our buildings as well, because they're all later. It was certainly thought in Tudor times that there were up to 50,000 people buried there.
Right, okay.
It's highly unlikely, because the population of London was probably 70,
That's-
maybe 90,000 at the very most.
That's a really good point, actually. Really
And although
good point.
the plague might have killed as many as half of the Londoners, it's impossible that they were all buried here.
Yeah,
And so we certainly know that there are thousands of Londoners buried here.
Now, it's very atmospheric standing in front of this entranceway to what was once one of the cells, because they lived solitary lives. Can you tell us a little bit about the monastic life of a Carthusian monk?
Certainly, yes. The Carthusians were of an order that was established in the French mountains in a place called Charterhouse, which is where we get the English word Charterhouse and the Latin word Carthusian. So anywhere that's called Charterhouse has had one of these monasteries established. You get them all over the country. There were actually 9 in the Middle Ages and at the point of the dissolution of the monasteries. But this was the most important of them. This was the house in charge of the whole Carthusian order in England.
Okay.
The monks, as you say, were solitary. They lived in their cells and they kept a vow of silence. They would only have communicated on feast days when they'd go to chapel to pray together, and on very, very important occasions, which we can come to a bit later.
Right.
But the Carthusians, robed in white, would have walked up and down the walkway here. They'd have cast their eyes down and not made contact with any of their fellow brothers.
Really, so no eye contact either, no. Really truly solitary.
That's right, and the reason for that is that, as we said, they were established in a mountainous valley in France. The whole idea of the order, established in the 11th century, was to remove yourself from the world, to go into seclusion, live a solitary life, and dedicate your life to prayer.
Now, I'm seeing on either side of the door a couple of sort of square hollows. What were they for then?
That's right. The serving hatch here, which is known as a guichet, would have had a...
Oh, I see, yes, it goes round.
It goes round onto the inside. So if you can imagine there was a door on this stone archway.
Yes.
It gave access to the outside to the monk, which means that the servants, the lay brothers who were monks themselves, but they hadn't sworn to seclusion, they would come around from the kitchens with a meal for the Carthusian who's inside his cell. They'd have placed down a tray of food, and the Carthusian can take it from inside, having had no contact with the outside world.
That's really cool, isn't it? And I read, is this right? You know, it was such a prestigious order that people sort of fought to get in here, even the kind of well-to-do folk. You know, it was quite a prestigious place to come.
The Carthusians in London were university-educated men. They had made a choice to come and live in the Charterhouse, to join that community. We certainly know that some of them had been courtiers. One of them was known to Henry VIII.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Who was that?
His name was Sebastian Newdigate.
Okay, right.
And he was one of the famous Carthusian martyrs.
Now, well, there's a topic. So you just beat me to it. And I think that's what we should, since we are here and we're talking about the Carthusians, because I think that was one of the most bloody, horrific episodes. Maybe we could go for a little walk and you could tell us a little bit about that history.
Yeah. The other very famous person to do with Charterhouse was, of course, Sir Thomas More. He had spent a number of years, we don't know precisely how long, but early in his career he'd come and lived with the Carthusians. He studied with them, and it's thought that he considered joining either their order or a monastic order, but decided that that wasn't the life for him. He was interested in the law and politics.
How fascinating to think Sir Thomas More roamed these cloisters, probably.
He certainly did, yes.
Wow, that's amazing. You've just blown my socks off. Thank you for that. So tell us about what happened. Everything was going swimmingly through the late medieval period, and Henry, of course, meets Anne Boleyn. His first wife doesn't give him a son. He starts to seek divorce from her and eventually breaks from Rome. And here we are in the centre of a whole maelstrom of events. How did it affect the Carthusians living here?
Fundamentally, this was the king's great matter, so it was the most talked about subject of the day. But we've already heard that the Carthusians had withdrawn from public life, and so they didn't believe that it would affect them at all. They'd taken their oath to come and live in seclusion, but the politics very much affected them in the 1530s.
What happened? Because, I think quite a few religious institutions hoped that they would be able to twist a few arms, pull in a few favours, avoid getting drawn into it, but it wasn't going to be the case here.
No, that's right. And the Carthusians had certainly enjoyed royal favour in the past, and we know that Henry was keen to have them on his side during his reforms of the church, particularly when it came to the Act of Succession. We certainly know of Thomas Cromwell's efforts to persuade the Carthusians to swear the oath upholding the new Protestant succession. Mm-hmm. It didn't work.
Who was the prior here at the time?
That's John Houghton, known today as Saint John Houghton, canonised in the 1970s. And he was responsible not just for his community of monks here, but all of the Carthusians in England. He became, alongside Thomas More, one of the principal opponents of the king's reforms of the church.
Yeah, and tell us what happened to him, because it was pretty awful, really, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. The king's commissioners under Thomas Cromwell came knocking, and they suggested to him that he command his monks to swear the oath upholding the succession. When he refused, he was sent to the Tower, and he spent some time there thinking about what he'd done. He was eventually persuaded by the Bishop of London that it wasn't breaking his Catholic faith to swear this oath of succession, that possibly that concession to the king would persuade the king and Cromwell to leave the Carthusians alone.
Right.
But that wasn't quite enough, because we know with hindsight that the king was looking at much more than just a new succession. He was looking at supremacy over the church. Now, John Houghton came back to the Charterhouse to speak to his monks. He gathered them in special meetings in the Charterhouse, and they broke their oath of silence to discuss what they would do.
Like you were saying, this is one of the most important, really important event that.
Most important. It's the only time really that kind of outside world has intruded on the London Charterhouse in 160 years since it had been here. We know that when another major event in London's history happened, the Peasants Revolts in the 1380s, we know that the Carthusians were so well respected by the Londoners that they were left alone when the riots happened.
Okay.
The neighbouring Priory of St John was burned to the ground, and the Charterhouse was left well alone. But in the 1530s, it became the very centre of that tumultuous religious politics of the day. And so John Houghton and his monks agreed, some of them anyway, that they would continue to oppose the king's reforms. We know that he sent some of his monks away so that they'd be safe.
Oh, okay. So how many monks were living here around that time?
There would have been 25 monks living in the cells of the great cloister.
Right.
There would have been the community of lay brothers serving them as well, and then others. There would have been staff and volunteers who came to the site. So it was a large community. It was a very well-known place, a big imposing church on the edge of the city. So John Houghton is looking after a lot of people here. He didn't take his decisions lightly, but we know that he felt that he had to oppose the king's reforms because it was impossible for him as a Catholic monk to accept anyone else but the Pope as the head of the church. And so those monks who decided to remain here with him knew that they were doing so in rebellion against the king.
And risking their lives. They must have known that was...
They would have known that. I don't suppose Thomas Cromwell was an easy man to deal with, and we think that John Houghton certainly knew what he was getting himself in for.
So I guess what happened was those John Houghton and those monks who refused to sign the Act of Supremacy were arrested. And what happened to them after that?
John Houghton returned to the Tower. He was with two of his Carthusian colleagues, priors of other houses in England.
Right.
They'd come down to London to discuss the response. They returned to the Tower, and this is at the same time that Thomas More is imprisoned in the Tower. And it was Thomas More who actually tells us in his diaries that his letters, in fact to his daughter, that he saw the Carthusians dragged out of the Tower of London. They were tied to a wooden frame and dragged by horses. The monks were taken all the way to Tyburn Gallows, which, if you're not familiar with London, is a very long way indeed. That's all the way from the Tower of London in the east to what's now the top of Oxford Street, where the Marble Arch is in the west.
Yes.
It was a public procession, and it was a public execution.
Yeah.
The monks were hanged, drawn and quartered, which we know is the ultimate punishment for political treason. It's high treason, which shows you exactly what Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell thought of the Carthusians. It wasn't necessarily a religious matter for them. It was a political decision to get rid of these opponents.
Yeah, stamping the royal authority. But that wasn't it, was it? Because some of the other monks suffered as well.
The monks were still here when their prior was taken away and executed. John Houghton's remains, as happened to all traitors in Tudor times, were spread far and wide. They put his head up on London Bridge as a reminder to people coming into London of what happens if you defy the king. And one of his arms was brought back to the Charterhouse. And it was nailed up to the gate. It was not just a warning to Londoners on the outside, but for the monks who were still inside, still refusing to swear the oath of supremacy. There's a great story about one of the monks who actually accepted a pension from the augmentations. He effectively quit as a Carthusian monk and lived to tell this tale. And he tells us about John Houghton's arm.
Oh, yes.
John Houghton's arm was nailed up to the gate as a reminder to those monks still inside that they were in defiance of the king. And this is what happens to you when you do that.
Yep.
Some of the remaining monks were arrested and they were dragged off to Newgate prison just down the road on the edge of the city. They were left there to starve to death.
Oh dear.
One of those monks seems to have been kept alive because he stayed in there for months. He was eventually taken out. He had not been persuaded to swear the supremacy, and he was hanged, drawn and quartered.
Oh really? Well. So he suffered for months and then ended up being executed?
There's a theory that he was kept alive on the orders of Cromwell to try and persuade him that he might be that monk who turns and then takes some of his colleagues with him, but it didn't work. The Carthusians continued to defy the king, and so two more of them were taken up to another Charterhouse in Hull in Yorkshire. They were again sent there to try and persuade their colleagues that this is not a good idea. You've got to surrender, and they were eventually hanged in chains from the walls of the city of York. Oh dear. But back to London. We hear about this monk who quit. And he tells us the story of one of the Carthusian, one of his colleagues called John Fox, John Fox accepted a pension from Edward North's Court of Augmentations. It wouldn't have been much, but it allowed him to go out into the world and to continue a career in the church. He became the rector of a church in the City of London. He was arrested many years later, and this is during Edward VI's Protestant government, fiercely Protestant government, and the reason for his arrest was that he was in possession of a banned holy relic. Veneration of relics was banned under the Protestant state, and when one was suspected of it, it was a crime punishable by death. John Fox was sentenced to death when it was revealed that this holy relic was the arm of Prior Houghton, which he'd kept in a box under the altar of his church. So even outside of his Carthusian life, he'd continued to venerate his old boss, effectively.
Continued loyalty.
Yeah, and he was only rumbled when he tried to smuggle the arm out of the country to go and live in exile in Belgium.
No, what a shame. Almost there.
Almost there. He was pardoned eventually because the government thought that by that time they didn't need to make any more martyrs.
I see, right. It was done. It was done.
And so those Carthusians, 16 in all, were executed for their faith. And they're remembered today as the Carthusian Martyrs.
Wow. Well, what a tale that is. And I'm standing here as listening to you talk, and you were talking about different names, and I could sort of imagine their ghostly presence just wandering up and down, listening to you retelling the story. It's very atmospheric in here.
It certainly is. We've heard some spooky things. But,
have you?
Yeah.
You got some ghost stories?
Nothing reliable. But,
there never is. You can't evidence it.
You'd expect them to develop naturally when you're on a site of a plague burial ground and a monastery where all the monks were executed. The home of the Duke of Norfolk, who famously was beheaded as well. These things happen.
Now, isn't this also, this cloister, speaking about the Duke of Norfolk, isn't this called the Norfolk Cloister?
That's right.
Because the architectures, you pointed out, the walls are very medieval stone, and then you've got this brick arched ceiling. Is that a later architectural feature from the Norfolk period?
Typically Tudor, as you can see. The grey stone of the monastery, the Great Cloister's wall, just abruptly ends at the first storey. The Carthusian cells would have been 2 storeys high, and that was knocked down at some point after the acquisition of the Charterhouse by Edward North. He would have used it for all sorts of things. There were storerooms. The king, Henry VIII, put up his court musicians in the cloister for a time. They'd come over to play at his wedding to Anne of Cleves. So they stayed here. It would have been a noisy place for once, unlike the silence of the Carthusian cloister. But it's the Duke of Norfolk who leaves his stamp today, and that's why we call it the Norfolk Cloister. He used this as a place of leisure. This was his garden gallery connecting the Great Hall, where we've just come from, to a tennis court at the far end.
I see.
This would have been an indoor real tennis court, like the one at Hampton Court. The Duke and his guests would have been able to walk through, admiring the garden through the arches, and then played a game of tennis, and then back to the hall at the other end.
Now, I'm just looking out of the window to where the huge monastic... It was massive, wasn't it? The garden and the cloister. Now, there is still some garden out there. And I can see an outline that looks like a square of buildings. So do they roughly sit on where the cloisters would have been?
Right. Yes, this is... it's a footprint that survives from about 1400, when the building of the cloister was completed. Today, that part of the old Charterhouse site is a medical school, so students are normally out there having their lunch. But the buildings of the school perfectly preserve the outline of the old Great Cloister, so you can see just how big it is.
Yeah, so you do get that feeling, don't you? And it's, I'm just trying to imagine the old building rising up, and what a formidable sight that would have been. So James, we've come now into one of the most magnificent rooms, I guess, in the Charterhouse, and this is the Great Hall, and we're standing towards the high end of the hall, aren't we, at the moment? And we've got this fabulous oriel window, some wonderful, beautiful arched windows, and those arches look very Tudor to me. So can you tell us a little bit about the place that this room has in the history of the Charterhouse?
Yes, of course. This is on the site of a dissolved monastery. That's the Charterhouse, and we can talk about that in other spaces. But what we need to know here is that in 1545, after the monastery was dissolved, a chap called Edward North acquired the site for development. And this was the result of that project. So in 1545, his builders came in, they tore down many of the old monastic buildings, and they raised up on the same site this magnificent Tudor courtyard mansion. And this was the entrance hall.
Right, it's wonderful. Because, of course, that happened a lot, didn't it? There was so much monastic property, and the Court of Augmentations started divvying it out.
Indeed.
And I believe, you correct me if I'm wrong, Edward North was a bit of a chum of Cromwell, who, of course, was right up to his eyeballs in the dissolution of the monasteries. Is that right?
They were both heavily involved. So Edward North was, for a time, the Chancellor of the Augmentations, which was a post that at times he shared with Richard Rich.
Yes, now I do know about Richard Rich. Boo, hiss, Richard Rich, yes.
So Richard Rich acquired some property over at St Bart's, just down the road, which was another monastery just outside the city of London. He built the Tudor gatehouse that still survives there. This was Edward North's patch, so he wanted to make an impression. He was an up-and-coming man at court. He was a trusted servant of Henry VIII. And this was his new London house.
Very swanky. Now, perhaps you could help describe the room, the scale of the room, and maybe some of the Tudor features that can still be seen here.
Yeah, so what we've got is a wood-panelled Tudor Great Hall, much of which, very sadly, was lost in a fire in 1941 when the Charterhouse was hit by incendiary bombs during the Blitz. The fire spread through most of the main courtyard, destroying lots of the interior, but you've got some miraculous survivals. Obviously, the stonework was largely unaffected, so
we've got this amazing fireplace, haven't we?
That's right.
Looks very Elizabethan to me, which would be right, wouldn't it?
Correct. Just a bit after. So this was
after.
carved in 1614, and that was to commemorate the founder of the charity that was established here just 3 years before that in 1611. The rest of the room with its wood panels is largely replacement from the 1950s. One of the greatest heritage restorations in the 20th century was done here.
Wow.
And it's actually difficult to tell what's replacement from the 50s and what's original, because just next to the wooden panels of the walls, you've got this magnificent three-arch screen that today has the kitchen beyond it, but in Edward North's time in the 1540s would have been the main entrance into the Great Hall. And the wooden screen survived the fire, and you can see just on the horizontal bar across the middle of it, there is the date on a shield, 1571.
And so there is. So let's take a stroll down, shall we, and have a look, and you can show me a little bit more detail.
That's right. If you come a bit closer, you can see on that horizontal it's the floor level above us.
Yes.
There's a Minstrels Gallery up there, and there are some shields decorating it. The middle one, as you can now see much clearer, is 1571. That's the date that was installed. On either side are some shields with the initials TN, which is for Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk.
That's interesting. He's using TN rather than TH. How interesting.
Yeah,
but of course they went by my Lord of Norfolk.
He went by title. He would have been Norfolk. Yes, indeed.
So one of the things you were explaining before we began this recording was that this house has been continuously lived in over the centuries, so it's continuously evolving. And although you were just telling us, the house was converted after the dissolution by Edward North?
Edward North.
Of course, Thomas Howard bought it after him, didn't he?
He did, yeah. Edward North was here until the 1560s when he died. Thomas Howard completed the purchase just after his death, and he embellished the house into something befitting one of the Grand Dukes of the realm. and we'll see some other parts of his house a bit later.
Well, maybe we'll pick up on the story of Thomas Howard here, because there's some quite interesting goings-on, wasn't there, in relation to him?
That's right.
But I tell you what I do love, James, is that beyond the screen's passage, you can also see in stone the 3 traditional entrances that you would have had in a medieval Tudor house, to the kitchen, the buttery and the pantry. So that's fantastic to see.
Yeah, the 3 entrances there were survivals of earlier buildings, and this is something that we see all over the Charterhouse. There are remnants of all of our different periods, so you'll see stonework that's medieval, leading into Tudor interiors that were redeveloped in the 19th century, in the 20th century. Everything has been changed over the years for continuous use.
Yeah, and you've got those archways are so typically Tudor, aren't they, with the little carved, I don't know what you call the edges, but they're so typically Tudor.
Very much so.
Yeah, wonderful. And so is there anything else we need to know about Edward North and his time here? How long did he live here, for example? Did anything particularly eventful happen while he was in residence?
Absolutely. He was a busy man. Edward North was a lawyer. And he served under Henry VIII's government on the augmentations, as we've said. He was one of the administrators responsible for seizing the wealth and the land of the monasteries and redistributing it. So we know that he ended up acquiring this site. We think that he was probably speculating on monastic sites and managed to land himself a prime spot just on the edge of the City of London. But Edward North's career gets really interesting after Henry VIII, because he'd served on the augmentations, dissolving the monasteries, but that meant that he'd allied himself very closely with the Protestant side of the Reformation. But of course, we know the twists and turns of Tudor religious politics means that didn't last particularly long. He was a privy councillor for Edward VI, and he was close to the king initially, having been a servant of his father. But various factions at court, including the king's uncle, sidelined him. We know that he was forced to make a really difficult decision after the death of young Edward VI, when Edward's half-sister Mary Tudor came to the throne, because that required not just a shift of the Privy Council, but also a commitment to a new religious direction, or rather the old one. They're going back to the old traditional Catholic worship. And Edward North was a canny operator. He seems to have switched sides.
Did he? He was one of those who bent like a willow rather than being an oak, to use a Tudor
impressively
phrase.
So, and perhaps even more impressively, he did it again when Elizabeth came to the throne, and stayed in favour under her as well. He's known as one of the very few Tudor statesmen who remained in favour with every one of those monarchs from Henry to Elizabeth.
So was he the chap who owned the Charterhouse when Elizabeth came to the throne?
That's right, yes.
And didn't she come here from Hatfield on her way into her state entry into London?
She certainly did. She's known to have stayed here for 5 nights.
Wow.
One of those royal visits that would have left the host significantly out of pocket, and certainly out of his house for a few days.
Yeah.
We know that Elizabeth held court in the Great Chamber just upstairs from the Great Hall here, and it was known as the Throne Room during that time. There she held the first meeting of her Privy Council, and she's known to have written letters from the Charterhouse and signed it from the Royal Palace in London at the Charterhouse.
So, before we move on and maybe talk a little bit more about the history, Elizabethan history and Elizabeth's visit, is there anything else we need to look at here in the Great Hall?
There certainly is, because shortly after Elizabeth's visit in 1611, we have a completely different use of this old building. And you can see from the portrait high up on the wall there, there's an elderly Elizabethan-looking gentleman with a large white beard, and he's holding in his hand a piece of paper, and his other hand a scroll. That's Thomas Sutton, and he's the founder of our charity. He was a wealthy commoner. He was a self-made man, and known as Rich Sutton, the richest commoner in England.
Oh, really? How interesting.
He was most famous for founding his charity. He left most of his tremendous wealth to this, which is it's an almshouse. His charity in 1611 was an almshouse and a school. That school is Charterhouse School, which is now down in Godalming in Surrey. It's one of the best-known public schools in the country.
It certainly is.
But the almshouse continues here. The community has been in continuous residence since the first residents, known as the Brothers of the Charterhouse, moved in 1614. And today, the Great Hall is their dining room.
Yes, and we're here on a beautiful day, aren't we? And the light is streaming in through these massive windows, but it's illuminating the hall, which is all laid out for lunch. This looks lovely.
Lunchtime's at 1 o'clock, and the kitchen are busy getting meals ready.
They are. I can see the steam rising off the pans back there in the kitchen. So that's what a wonderful place to have your lunch. That's all I can say. So how are the brothers chosen? Who qualifies to come and live here?
The brothers apply to come and live in the almshouse. They are over the age of 60. They are single, and they have constrained finances. So they're people who are in need of financial support and, most importantly, of a home. And the Charterhouse is a place for them to come and live as part of a community. Oh. So they have individual flats all around the old buildings. Some are in the Tudor buildings, some are further back in 7 acres of gardens. And this is the heart of the community. This is where they come together in the Great Hall for their meals. And lunch is the main meal of the day at 1 o'clock.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for showing us the Great Hall. And maybe we should move on to our next room and pick up this story of the Charterhouse.
Certainly, let's do it.
Before we go any further, if you enjoy these podcasts, did you know that you can support my work by becoming a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month? A link to find out more about this programme and the different levels of sponsorship available is included in the description associated with this podcast. And while I can't thank you in person, here's a big mwah to say a massive thank you from me. So now it's back to the show. James, you brought me outside. Thank you, because it's a glorious day with absolutely crystal clear blue skies, and we're in a courtyard. Can you tell me about this courtyard and why it's significant?
This one is it's the main courtyard of Edward North's house from the 1540s, and today it's known as Master's Court. The Master is the person in charge of the charity, first appointed in 1611 by Thomas Sutton and his governors, to look after the welfare of the residents of the almshouse, the brothers. The courtyard's known as Master's Court because through the 17th and 18th century, the Master would have had palatial apartments on the south range of the old Tudor house. Today, the Master lives in the gatehouse on the square, which is a beautiful house that we can have a look at from the outside. So she doesn't live in quite the palatial accommodation she did before, but she's still on site and she manages the charity and the care of the brothers.
I see. So it's like the CEO of the charity,
Exactly.
essentially.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And now, there are some interesting architectural features. We've got the Great Hall next to us here. We were inside the Great Hall, now we're outside the Great Hall, but there's sort of various different sort of Tudor arches, some bits look medieval. What am I looking at?
Again, As with everything at the Charterhouse, it's a real mix. We've got bits and pieces from most centuries from the 14th century onwards. And if you know what you're looking for, there are some really fascinating clues to the whole history of the place. Walking through the courtyard here, you're following in the footsteps of Edward North, the Duke of Norfolk, and their guests. So they would have entered through the large archway on the south side, that have gone around the courtyard and in through what's now the kitchen, where we stood earlier, into the Great Hall, and then upstairs to the Great Chamber, which is the main reception room of the house. So you can see it's an imposing courtyard house. It's designed to make an impression on those people visiting for the first time. And it still does today. The most impressive thing about this is that apart from the very tip of one of the Barbican blocks of flats over there, you wouldn't know that you were in the middle of central London, just on the edge of the city.
Yes, I was just thinking, what a fine townhouse to own if you were back in now, but certainly back in the 16th century. And I remember reading a letter, because the Latimers lived on Charterhouse Square, Catherine Parr and her third husband. And I remember him saying he really loved that property because it was out of the press of the city.
That's right.
So it was in the countryside, right? Almost. I mean,
yeah. So the Carthusian monastery was as near to the city of London as they dared to be for a bunch of monks who had withdrawn from the world and were looking for seclusion. They were just on the edge of one of the busiest cities in Europe. But even then, beyond them to the north would have been fields as far as Islington. Today, we're right in the thick of things. But in Tudor times, it was one of those strategic locations that gave Edward North and later Thomas Howard space for extensive gardens and grand architecture, but it also gave them really quick access to the royal court and to the city of London.
Yes, and I guess also because it's on the north of the city, for anybody who needed to travel north, because Norfolk obviously had properties. I can't remember whether the Howards had abandoned Kenning Hall by then in Norfolk, but you're on the way out, aren't you, to the country property as well? It was all very convenient.
Right. So Thomas Howard was all over the place because he was such an ambitious man and so important as the Duke of Norfolk. It's an important role in those times. But this was his main house. And it was very, very convenient for the city, as it remains today. The brothers can come here and live in peace and quiet in the 7 acres of gardens. But as soon as they step out of their door, they've got all the convenience of city life.
That's marvellous. What's your favourite feature about this courtyard then, do you think, James?
Again, it's the fact that if you know what you're looking for, you can see exactly how it's developed over the centuries, beginning with the dissolution of the monastery. So if you cast your eyes down onto the pavement around the edge of the courtyard, we've got some black lines set into the paving stones.
So you do.
And that shows us the foundations of the old monastery buildings. So you can see that this courtyard has been put down directly on top of some of those buildings.
Where would we have been standing?
We would have been in some of the service buildings.
Okay.
We've come from inside. The corridor, the Norfolk Cloister that we were in, was where the monks lived. This is where the lay brothers would have lived and worked. So the kitchens were on the far side, and the laundry, the wash house, is something that we can see as well today. And that's a surviving building from the monastery. So it would have connected up with a labyrinth of corridors. But today, in 1545, it was flattened and it was turned into this. A bit of archaeology has been done over the years, so we know roughly that layout. We know that some of the rooms on the east side of the courtyard would have been chapels attached to the main Carthusian church, and we know this because in 1941, when that fire happened after the Blitz, the people who were restoring the house all the way through to the 1950s. Dug up the courtyards. They found the foundations, but they also had to restore the buildings themselves. And in doing so, they removed some of the masonry. What they found was that the builders hadn't gone far at all to build the mansion. They had torn down the monastic buildings and they'd reused the same stone for the house. So on the outside here, goes up to about shoulder height. We've got some decorative stone, which is quite worn down these days, but that's because it dates
from the 1370s.
Wow.
That was on the inside of the Carthusian church, and it's been repurposed here as decoration for the outside of Edward North's Great Hall. We've also got good reason to believe that the main windows of the Great Hall were church windows from the 14th century as well.
I see.
The square bay there would have been an addition by Edward North, but
Yes.
these are very much medieval
Yes.
church windows.
They were great at repurposing, the Tudors. I always say they were really good at recycling things.
Well, you've got good building material. Why bother bringing in more?
Yeah.
One really fascinating thing that they found was a loose piece of stone set into one of the walls here.
Mm-hmm.
They prized out this loose piece of stone, and they found that it was a fragment of a painted statue of St. Catherine of Alexandria. That's the one who was tortured on the Catherine wheel.
Yes.
It didn't kill her, so eventually she was beheaded. But what this statue shows is that she's standing on the head of the Roman emperor who ordered her death. She was removed by Edward North builders from one of the chapels of the Carthusian church dedicated to St. Catherine. She was hacked to bits and squared off and used as masonry for building the new house in the 1540s.
They really didn't care, did they?
They didn't, indeed. That's the destructiveness of the Reformation.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. Now, you mentioned also this Washer's Court?
Washhouse Court.
Washhouse Court. Can we go and have a look at that? Because I'm very intrigued by the fact you say there is an original building there. It'd be lovely to see
Let's do that now. So what we've got is, on this side, the repurposed building from the 1540s. What we're about to do is walk through an archway to one of the last constructed monastic buildings. The reason that it still stands intact is that Edward North, in the 1540s, didn't need to replace it. It was a new building. It was built in the 1530s under John Houghton. And so...
Oh, we're walking in this fabulous corridor, aren't we, with these lovely Tudor arched doorways. Oh, fantastic. I've never been in here.
So as we pass through here, we see where Edward North's 1540s house meets the old buildings of the monastic washhouse.
Yes.
And so this courtyard would have been the laundry for the monks. It's where the lay brothers would have done their domestic work. And it would have connected, as you can see, from those lines in the pavement on the other side,
Yes.
all the way through to the great cloister, this labyrinth of monastic buildings.
What a lovely stone courtyard. And yes, the change in architecture is not subtle, is it? You can really easily see it. I mean, that looks very Tudor with the diapering there.
Exactly. The black bricks pick out some patterns in the red Tudor brickwork. You can see even more of it on the far side, which we can go and have a look at.
Yes,
but there's a very striking moment where the new house meets the old monastic wash house. Rough grey and golden stone just meets red brick in a very distinct line above the doorway.
Yeah, absolutely, it does.
And it shows you where the two buildings meet. This is now brothers' accommodation. So on all sides, you've got the brothers' flats on the ground floor and the top two floors. And their accommodation runs throughout the old Tudor house.
Lovely. So where are you taking me now then, James? Where are we going? Right. Oh, yes, how lovely. So we're coming out into another beautiful garden and another courtyard.
This is always unexpected for our visitors because this is where the garden really starts. You can see some of the brothers are out enjoying the sunshine.
Yes.
This is Preacher's Court. The preacher is a resident member of staff at the Charterhouse who's looking after the spiritual needs of the community. There is a working chapel on site run by the preacher. And although the brothers aren't a religious organisation these days,
yes.
It is there for them. The preacher also looks after the well-being of the community. Geographically, we're about halfway into the Charterhouse site, but beyond this, there are another two courtyards of gardens, and they've got buildings from different periods. So this is the very end of the Tudor house. You can see that red brickwork with the black decorations again.
So yeah, we're standing at the corner of a typically Tudor-looking building, right?
This is the back of the washhouse, so it was the service buildings for the monks, built in the 1530s under John Houghton. And it's very reminiscent of the service buildings at places like Hampton Court and Fulham Palace. Is another really great example of this Tudor red brick with the black decorations.
Yes.
The really tall chimney stacks.
Yes, because it does remind me of the kind of the service end of Hampton Court. It's very Tudor, but it's not too fussy.
It's not the part that the guests
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And beyond here, we've got the gardens which the brothers are enjoying. You've got accommodation on all sides, including some modern buildings put up in the year 2000. You've got on the far end the Victorian Infirmary building. And then on the right-hand side in the distance, there's the outside wall of the Norfolk Cloister that we were standing inside earlier.
Ah, right. Yes, I
garden.
see. I'm orientated now. Yeah, absolutely.
And so this would be quite familiar to the Duke of Norfolk as he's walking through his garden.
Yes, now speaking of gardens in Norfolk, I distinctly remember that it was at least partly while he was walking in the gardens of the Charterhouse that he is said to have had various conversations with some of those, obviously, who were friendly to Norfolk, about his potentially marrying Mary Queen of Scots. So that's another reason, right, that this place is so important from a Tudor history point of view.
Unfortunately for Thomas Howard, the thing he's most famous for is becoming embroiled in plots, and that happened here. We know that he met agents involved in a conspiracy, variously to get married to Mary Queen of Scots, but also to overthrow his cousin, Queen Elizabeth I.
Yeah.
And that's said to have happened in the gardens of Howard House, which is what he called the Charterhouse when he was here.
Yeah.
That's probably the area now known as the Norfolk Garden, over by the old cloister, but it's certainly in the main courtyard of the house as well. Coming inside here from the main courtyard, you're still in a Tudor part of the house. Today it's where we have our museum. So we've got the best bits of our historic collection on display to the public, and a new main entrance which brings people in straight off of Charterhouse Square into a reception area with a classroom and the museum, and that's where we start our guided tours of the house. So there's a sort of a public area where people can come in and learn all about our history without disturbing the privacy of the brothers.
And we'll make sure that we talk about those tours at the end, because there will be people listening who are going, how can I go around, what can I see? So we'll come back to that in a moment. This new entrance I think is particularly lovely, and I love the garden, but it's also very historically significant. I think I'm right in saying.
It is. The entrance here is set out to show you where the Carthusian church was. So there's a white slab there in the garden, which is the tomb of a man. He was the founder of the Carthusian church in 1371. Not only that, he was also the man who leased that patch of land outside the city of London that's now Charterhouse Square to bury the dead of the Black Death. Okay. And that's Sir Walter Manny.
Right.
Walter Manny was a knight who served King Edward III in the 100 Years' War. He fought in France and in Scotland, made quite a name for himself, and was very influential at the King's court. He was the sponsor of the cemetery and the monastery, and he was buried in front of the high altar of the Carthusian church.
Top spot.
Top spot indeed. He was only rediscovered in the 1940s when that excavation was being done after the bombing. He was thought to have been buried in front of the altar of the church from documents, but he'd never been found, and that's because the actual location of the Carthusian church was long lost. There were theories that it was roughly where today's chapel stands, but that's partly a 17th century building. And so archaeology in the 1940s showed that it was actually where this garden is now. And the reason for that is the medieval tower of today's chapel. That's partly 14th century, and actually would have been part of an inside wall. There's a hole just above the windows on the first floor of the tower, and that hole reminded the architects who were restoring the house of something called a squint, which is an interior feature of a church. A squint is an aperture which is at the floor level of an upstairs room. And if you look down through that aperture, you can see, in theory, down to the high altar. The purpose of the squint was that the treasurer, who's up in the treasury on the first floor, can remain at his post and still observe Mass. And so if you follow the line of the squint upstairs and dig a trench down there, you will find the location of the high altar and therefore the body of Sir Walter Manny.
That's fantastic, isn't it? How wonderful. It's like what a great clue that's been left.
It was a bit of detective work, and this year marks the 650th anniversary of his foundation of the London Charterhouse.
That's fantastic. And I do love that monument. I mean, it's very simple. Is it marble, stone, slab? But it's just perfect.
Yeah, it's a gleaming white monument. He would have had a much grander tomb inside the church then, because of that legacy that he left in founding the church. He was buried here in a grand funeral that was attended by King Edward III, but also all of his sons.
Oh, really?
So it would have been a really big state occasion.
Crikey, yes, that would have been a massive occasion. Fantastic. Now, I understand straight ahead of us is the chapel, so why don't we wander in that general direction and you can talk to me about... I'm really interested to know, was any of this chapel part of the original monastic building? Has this been repurposed? Because you mentioned some of it is 17th century.
Yes. So the chapel was expanded. It was turned into the chapel of the Charterhouse community as established by Thomas Sutton. So it was for the brothers of the almshouse and the scholars of Charterhouse School. They'd have worshipped in here together. And that's why you've got the church in two halves, where the different members of the community would have sat. It's a much bigger community than would have been here in the Middle Ages and in Tudor times, and that explains the shape of the building today. But the aisle that we're standing in, which is the south aisle of the chapel, has the altar at the far end, and this room that we're standing in. This is the underneath of the chapel tower, and this is a medieval space. This would have been a vestibule, which was the entrance into the chapter house.
Oh, I was going to ask you, because you were talking about, of course, that really important meeting with John Houghton. And I was going to say, do we know where the chapter house is? So it would have been here in front of us where the chapel is standing.
That's right,
now.
yeah. So the aisle of the chapel on the right-hand side preserves exactly the shape of the monks' chapter house. And you can see the corridor that we've just walked in through the old Tudor house into today's chapel would have been a walkway for the monks through from the cloister into their chapter house. And this is where they came to break their oath of silence and discuss their response to the royal supremacy.
And I couldn't help noticing a rather magnificent painting which captures I presume, the execution of John Houghton and those monks that died with him up at Tyburn.
There are a lot of famous portrayals of that moment. It was a very popular piece of propaganda at the time of the Reformation. This is a much later painting, and it's one of those events in history that's painted again and again by successive generations. But a very famous image is an engraving of different panels showing the journey of the Carthusians from the Tower of London to Tyburn, their execution, and then the display of their body parts. And this was sent far and wide across Europe as an example of the barbaric things that were going on in England at the time of the Reformation.
Wow. I feel very honoured to be in this space and imagining, again, I've got a very active imagination, if you hadn't guessed by now, James, but imagining the monks filing into here and having that most Well, that life and death conversation, essentially. They must have known what they were committing to when they decided that they were...
If they didn't know when they entered, they would have known when they left. It was a hugely important occasion, not just in the lives of these men, but in the course of the English Reformation. And it happened right here.
Wow. But I'm also seeing out of the corner of my eye a rather splendid tomb in the corner of the church, or the chapel. Perhaps you might want to just tell us who's there.
Yes.
Who's buried over there?
There are all sorts of people buried beneath the chapel, and there are memorials on the walls to lots of people who've been connected with the charity over the centuries. But the most important one, and the grandest monument of them all, is that of the founder of the charity, Thomas Sutton.
Wow, that is quite a monument. Can you try and describe that visually? I mean, it's enormous. It's floor to ceiling for a start, isn't it?
It butts against the ceiling.
Yeah.
It's the kind of thing that you would expect to see in a cathedral. It's almost precisely what Thomas Sutton did not want for his memorial.
Oh.
He was not interested in pomp and circumstance. He gave his money to his charity, and it was intended as a good deed. And it was a lot of money. You'll remember that he was considered the richest commoner in England at the time of his death. And actually, he died the same year that he left his money and established his charity.
Oh,
so
really?
he established the almshouse and the school and secured an act of parliament, which meant that they were incorporated as a charity for posterity, and it still goes to this day. But then he died before any of the first brothers or scholars moved in 3 years later.
So, James, we've come up to the first floor level for the first time, and we're in your magnificently and very recently restored Great Chamber. And I know that we've touched on this, and particularly its association with Norfolk and maybe Elizabeth. But I would love you to tell us, the relevance of this chamber to the house, and how is it involved with the history of the Charterhouse?
It's involved in almost every period of Charterhouse history. It was part of the Tudor mansion that was constructed by Edward North in the 1540s, and we've essentially followed the route of a guest into the house. We've come through the courtyard, we've come into the entrance hall, which is now the brothers' dining room downstairs, and then we've processed up the staircase to the main reception room. And this is very typical of a Tudor house. It's the Great Chamber, which is the main reception room for guests. And some Tudor houses still have these rooms. Hatfield House is a particularly good example. But many, and certainly the ones in London, don't survive. And so we're very proud to say that this is the last remaining Tudor Great Chamber in London.
Is it really? How fantastic is that? That's wonderful. So can we have an idea of the dimensions? Again, I'll put images of this up on the show notes, but what kind of dimensions are we talking about for this room? And in fact, is it as it would have looked in the Tudor period?
Yes and no. It's a vast room with a huge fireplace, and you can see that that's sort of offset. It's to the right of that main wall.
Yes. It's not square in the room, is it? It's a sort of two-thirds of the way along.
Which shows that at some point in history the room has been extended. So in Thomas Howard's days the room would have been slightly shorter. But what does survive from his time is the ceiling, which spans the length of the room, with coats of arms. You can see it's the Order of the Garter, and it's members of his family. Also, in blue and gold along the perimeter are his motto,
Yes, I was just going to ask you, can you read that for us?
That's sola virtus invicta, which is Latin, and says that virtue alone is invincible.
It's a shame he didn't have any, really, isn't it? Oh, I'm being unkind now, but did he actually build this great chamber?
He certainly embellished it. Again, he bought a house that was already standing from the 1540s. He moved in the 1560s and set about doing lots of improvements. We know that there was a particularly fierce period of building in the early 1570s, and that's for a very, very good reason. You'll remember in the Great Hall we saw the wooden screen with the date 1571. We've also seen the red brick archway over the old Monastic Cloister. That was his in the 1570s as well. And the ceiling here dates from the same time. And this period of building coincides with the time that Thomas Howard spent a very, very large amount of his time at home in Howard House. And that's because he was under house arrest.
Ah, yes. Well, we touched a little bit on his shenanigans that got him into trouble, but maybe we can complete the story. What happened with Thomas Howard and his involvement in various plots?
So we've heard that conspirators were here at Howard House, and they were talking about a potential match between the 4th Duke and Mary, Queen of Scots. This is something that Thomas Howard himself pursued years before. He seems to have, to an extent, given up on it as a prospect, perhaps because it was quite a risky thing to do. He wasn't firmly on either side of the religious debate. He'd been raised a Protestant in a family with very strong Catholic connections, but he'd been educated by both sides, and it was thought to be his family who were pushing him towards a match. But there does seem to have been a connection between himself and Mary, Queen of Scots. However, where things get really interesting here at Howard House, as the Charterhouse was known, is in the 1570s when Elizabeth I becomes aware of a conspiracy. This is a conspiracy that was intended to overthrow her and place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne of England. And there are some clues to that in this room.
Oh, tell me.
Because you've got the heraldic ceiling with the coats of arms across the whole length of the room. But in this corner, there's a square bay. It's an alcove with a piece of original ceiling. Most of the ceiling was lost in the fire in 1941, but this part survived, and it's been restored and looked after, and it thankfully preserves for us Thomas Howard's own coat of arms and some really interesting symbols around it.
Yes, we've got some lions, haven't we? Some red lions.
The lions occur a lot in Thomas Howard's heraldry. He's got the lions on the screen in the Great Hall as well. But the really interesting bit are the bits you might not notice, which are the flowers around the outside of the central square.
Yes.
Those flowers look, if you ask me, very much like thistles.
Yeah, I'll buy that, absolutely.
And that's thought to have been an indicator to
with her
Thomas
union
Howard's affection for Mary, Queen of Scots. Whether it's wise to advertise that on your ceiling is another matter.
The Howards were good at advertising things that got them into trouble. Henry Howard, of course, was accused of showing off arms that he wasn't supposed to be showing off, that kind of reinforced his claim potentially to the throne. So yeah, here we've got another Howard.
That's right, and so these are very connected people. Thomas Howard was a descendant of King Edward I and related to Queen Elizabeth I through her maternal grandmother. So they were a closely related and well connected group of people, and that regularly got the family into trouble. You've said about Henry Howard, but Thomas Howard's father was also imprisoned, and there were successive counts of high treason against them. And Thomas Howard didn't want to be left out.
No, absolutely. But that is a gorgeous ceiling, isn't it? With those beautiful curvy lines and the coat of arms, and the gold just glistens in the lights. Absolutely gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. Now, you mentioned Elizabeth. And if I look to my left here, we've got a portrait of the lady in question. And is this an original, by the way?
This is a copy that was made specially for us, especially for this room, done in 2019 by an artist called Yin Yang.
It's a beautiful one, actually, isn't it?
It really is. It's a copy
really
of a
well.
1583 original, and this is Elizabeth holding a sieve, which demonstrates her qualities as a legendary virgin, because the legendary virgin was said to be able to carry water in a sieve. So virtuous was she, and there she is. Elizabeth would have held court in this room. We've heard that she visited on her way from Hatfield down to London to be crowned, and this is where she would have held the
some
meeting.
of her first council meetings. Right. It just gets me so excited that, because you've got this beautiful young queen full of energy and vigour. Must have been a great relief to her after the trials and tribulations of her half-sister's reign, and she was finally
Yes, and so here she was. That was before Thomas Howard's time, but he's next in our story because by the 1570s he was here under house arrest, and it was 1572 when his association with the Charterhouse ended. Because
so how long was he under house arrest here?
He was here for almost 2 years.
Okay.
And that's, we know, when he did most of his renovations of the house, presumably because there wasn't much else to do. But we do know that he was regularly visited by conspirators. The orchestrator of all of this was a guy called Roberto Ridolfi, who was a Florentine merchant banker, very well connected all across Europe. He had connections in the court of Spain, with the Pope, and with Mary, Queen of Scots. And he was the go-between for these letters. And it's the letters that were discovered here that got Thomas Howard into trouble.
Was it suddenly searched then, the house, sort of unexpectedly? Is that how the letters came to be found?
Yeah, Thomas Howard was caught red-handed, more or less, because not only did he have possession of letters from Mary, he also had a copy of the cipher which encoded them. So for Elizabeth's agent, it wasn't too difficult to put the two together. They were found in his private apartments.
And you're indicating private apartments behind you because there is a doorway, I guess, that was the sort of the high end of the chamber that actually led through to...
That's right. So that leads through to the where the Minstrels Gallery is above the Great Hall, and that would have been Thomas Howard. So personal apartments, long since repurposed into other things, as most things are at the Charterhouse. But you can see he would have had direct access to his grand reception room.
Yes. So he was carted off to the Tower and, of course,
another visit to the Tower of London for someone associated with the Charterhouse. It happened frequently. Yes, he was publicly beheaded. They had to construct a special scaffold for him on Tower Hill, and there were great crowds there witnessing.
So it needed to be tall enough. Is that what you mean? So everybody could see what was going on.
Yeah, he was publicly beheaded outside the Tower of London.
Dear, oh dear. Well, there you go. That's probably the end of the bloody history of the Charterhouse.
Well, there are a couple of extra bits, because the house passed on to his son, who was imprisoned for claiming his father's title and for being a Catholic. He died in imprisonment in the Tower of London, actually before he could be executed. It's thought that Elizabeth I was reluctant to sign his death warrant, and he ended up spending more than 10 years in the Tower. But the house then comes into the hands of Thomas Howard's second son, who was also Thomas Howard. And it's him who arranges the sale of the house to Thomas Sutton, and that's the establishment of the charity here at the Charterhouse.
And then we go all the way back round to our story. And it is quite challenging, isn't it? We talked about telling the story chronologically, but of course so many rooms in the Charterhouse overlap with different periods of history. So it's really dripping in Tudor history here.
Yeah, as we've said from the very beginning, we're living history here, so that the house is in use and has been more or less continuously since the first monks moved in the 1370s. The purposes have been very different, but actually for the bulk of our history here, more than 400 years, we've been doing much the same thing, which is providing a place to live and support for a community of older people in need. And those are the brothers of the Charterhouse today. There are a group of about 40 men and women who were first allowed to come and live here in 2017. And you've had a really good look around some of the areas of their home.
Well, thank you.
Gardens today.
I just want to thank you so much. But before we do finish today, I want to be able to talk to you about how people can come and visit here. So what would you like to tell us about how people can find out more about the Charterhouse, and what kind of events or how can people visit the Charterhouse?
Well, we're delighted to be reopening to the public for the first time in more than a year, and we're doing that on the 1st of June.
So by the time actually this podcast goes out, because we're recording this in late April, but this will be out in June, so you will be open by that time.
We're selling tickets already, and they're going fast. But our website is thecharterhouse.org, and you can book tickets for various types of visit. You can come and see the inside of the house with one of our guides. You can meet one of the brothers who will take you around and give you a more personal view of what it's like to live in such a historic place. Or you can come on a tour with the gardening team, and they'll show you around our 7 acres of wonderful gardens. So there's a lot to do here. We have a small museum showing off the best bits of our historic collection as well. And hopefully that will give everyone a really good idea of all of those hugely important events that have happened over those centuries of history.
Thank you so much. So that email, the website address again is
thecharterhouse.org. And you can find us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram.
Well, you heard it here, ladies and gentlemen, so please do visit. It's a wonderful place. And I would say off the usual tourist trap. So if you want to get away from the Westminster Abbeys where you can't breathe because of people, this is a wonderful place to come, isn't it?
Yeah, you've seen today that we are a bit of an oasis in central London. Once you step through the gates into the Charterhouse, you've got peace and quiet that's really quite unusual to find in this part of the world.
Absolutely.
You can come straight off of the street from Barbican Tube Station, and here you are.
And here you
wouldn't
are.
know you were in the middle of central London.
Yeah, just like the Tudors enjoyed it, a bit of quiet away from the press of the city.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much, James. You've been an amazing host today. I really appreciate you showing us around.
It's been my pleasure.
Psst. Before we finish the show, remember you can support my work via my Patreon programme, where various levels of sponsorship are available, starting at just $1 a month. Check out all the details of how to become a patron in the link included with this podcast. Oh, and don't forget, you can be part of my closed Facebook group where fellow time travellers like you hang out with me and each other to share some of our favourite things about visiting the UK. From great Tudor places to visit, to the best way to take your cream tea in an afternoon. From the latest travel news to the traditional Sunday roast. So don't miss out, and you can apply to join by clicking on the link in the description. So now it's back to close the show. I do hope you enjoyed that in-depth tour of the Charterhouse, and it's a big thank you to James, our tour guide, and also to Charlotte behind the scenes who made this visit possible. And I hope that you're inspired to visit if you haven't already, and if you have visited the Charterhouse, that you'll consider making that a stop on your Tudor itinerary next time you are in London. And I just wanted to add that the Charterhouse are holding open garden events. Now, these are ticketed events through the summer. So if you wanted to go and make the most of the gardens, there are refreshments available and they are very beautiful. Then make sure you check out the Charterhouse website. And there is a blog associated with this podcast, and I'll make sure that I put the link in there. So check out the description associated with this episode to find out more. Okay, well, before we go, all I wanted to say, as ever, is a massive thank you to all my patrons who keep supporting the show. I really, really do appreciate it. It does help me keep the Tudor Travel Guide going and keep the show on the road so that I can keep getting out and about and recording, particularly these on-location episodes. And finally, remember, if you want to indulge in your own Tudor immersive weekend at the Old Hall in Norfolk, then you will find a link to find out more information or to book your spot in the description associated with this podcast. It'd be wonderful to see you there. It's going to be a fabulous weekend full of Tudor entertainment and fun. Well, my friends, that's it for this month. So, of course, I'll be back with the next Travel Essential podcasts very soon, and I will look forward to seeing you there. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. If you've loved the show, please take a moment to subscribe, like and rate this podcast so that we can spread the Tudor love. Until next time, my friends, all that remains for me to say is happy time travelling!